The 47-year wait for justice. The Jody Loomis murder. August 23, 1972. It was a Wednesday afternoon in Snohomish County, Washington, and 20-year-old Jody Loomis was doing what she loved most, heading out to visit her horse. The nursing student from Mill Creek had her whole life ahead of her. She was engaged to be married, planning to work at the same hospital as her fiancé after graduation. She was known for speaking her mind, for helping others, for loving animals with a fierce devotion. At around 5 o'clock that evening, Jody hopped on her bicycle and pedaled away from her family home, heading toward a stable about 6 miles away where her beloved horse was boarded. It was a route she'd taken countless times before. The sun was still high in the August sky, and she had no reason to believe this ride would be any different from all the others. But Jody Loomis would never make it to that stable, and for 47 years, her family would wait for answers about what happened on that secluded dirt road. This is the story of a cold case that spanned nearly half a century, of DNA evidence that sat overlooked for decades, and of the groundbreaking genetic genealogy that finally brought a killer to justice, even as he tried to escape it one final time. Around 5:30 that evening, a young couple decided to take their car down a remote dirt road off Highway 96, looking for a quiet spot to do some target shooting. It was the kind of back road that most people didn't know about, a shadowy path that wound through dense woods halfway between Mill Creek and the stables where Jody was headed. As they drove deeper into the woods, the couple's car came to an abrupt stop. A fallen tree blocked the narrow road ahead. They got out to move the obstacle, annoyed at the interruption to their plans. But as they approached the tree, they saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A young woman lay on the ground, partially clothed, clutching at her exposed bra. She wore knee-high socks and dark hiking boots with distinctive chunky waffle soles. Blood matted her hair above her right ear. She was alive, barely, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. But she couldn't speak, couldn't tell them what had happened, couldn't identify who had done this to her. The couple didn't hesitate. They scooped Jody up, not stopping to cover her exposed body, not stopping to look for evidence, thinking only of getting her to help as fast as possible. They laid her in their car and raced toward Stevens Hospital, now known as Swedish Edmonds, driving as fast as the winding roads would allow. But it was already too late. Jody Loomis was pronounced dead upon arrival. A single bullet from a .22 caliber pistol had entered her skull just above her right ear. The autopsy would later confirm what the responding officers had suspected. Jody had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Department immediately launched a homicide investigation. Detectives returned to that secluded dirt road, processing the scene in the fading evening light. They collected the bullet that had killed Jody. They photographed tire tracks, footprints, the disturbed earth where her body had lain. And they carefully documented and collected biological evidence from Jody's body and clothing, including her distinctive hiking boots with the waffle soles. This was 1972, long before DNA analysis would become a standard tool in criminal investigations. The biological evidence was preserved and cataloged, but investigators had no way to analyze it in any meaningful way. They were left with traditional detective work, interviewing witnesses, tracking down leads, building timelines. Jody's family was devastated. Her parents, John and Rosemary Loomis, and her younger sister Jana, couldn't comprehend how their vibrant, strong-willed daughter and sister could be taken from them so suddenly, so violently. Jody had been so close to achieving her dreams, to starting her career as a nurse, to building a life with her fiancé. Now those dreams lay shattered on a dirt road in the woods. The investigation quickly hit dead ends. There were no witnesses to the actual attack. Jody's bicycle was found near the scene, but it yielded no useful evidence. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Jody, looking for any hint of who might have wanted to hurt her. They came up empty. By all accounts, Jody was well liked, with no enemies, no one who would want her dead. Several potential suspects emerged and were questioned, but each was ruled out through alibis or lack of evidence connecting them to the crime. As weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the case grew colder. The evidence sat in storage, the biological samples carefully preserved but useless with the technology of the time. John and Rosemary Loomis held on to hope that someday, somehow, they would get answers. But as the years stretched on, that hope began to fade. By the late 1970s, the Jody Loomis case had joined the ranks of countless other unsolved homicides, another name in a filing cabinet, another family left without closure. It would remain that way for more than 3 decades. In the early 2000s, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department established a dedicated cold case unit, a team of detectives tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides using modern forensic techniques. They began systematically going through old case files, looking for cases where DNA evidence had been collected, but never properly analyzed. In 2008, 36 years after Jody Loomis's murder, a crime lab technician made a crucial discovery while reviewing the Jody Loomis evidence. Biological material, specifically semen, had been preserved on one of Jody's hiking boots, the distinctive waffle-soled boots she'd been wearing when she was killed. The evidence had been noted in the original case file, but in the chaos and confusion of the initial investigation, it had somehow been overlooked by subsequent investigators. The cold case team immediately recognized the significance of this discovery. They sent the evidence to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA analysis. But there was a problem. The sample was old and degraded from decades of storage. The DNA profile they were able to extract was partial and somewhat deteriorated. It was enough to rule out potential suspects, but it wasn't complete enough to make a definitive match if they found a suspect. Still, it was progress. The cold case detectives began reinvestigating the case with this new evidence in hand. They tracked down the original suspects who had been questioned in 1972 and obtained DNA samples from those who were willing. None matched. They looked for new suspects, people who had been in the area at the time but had never been questioned. They ran the partial DNA profile through criminal databases, looking for hits. Nothing. For another decade, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. The DNA profile sat in the system, waiting for a match that never came. John Loomis passed away in 2004, never knowing who killed his daughter. Rosemary and Jana continued to hope, but the pain of not knowing never lessened, never faded with time. Then, in 2018, everything changed. The arrest of the Golden State Killer in April 2018 sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. Joseph James D'Angelo had been identified and captured using a revolutionary new technique called forensic genealogy, or genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded DNA from crime scenes to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, databases where regular people submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and find distant relatives. The technique worked by finding partial matches to the suspect's DNA among the thousands of people in these databases. Once investigators found several matches, they could work with professional genealogists to build family trees, tracing back to common ancestors, and then forward to identify the suspect. It was the same process that adopted children used to find their biological parents, repurposed for law enforcement. The Snohomish County Cold Case Unit immediately saw the potential. They contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that specialized in forensic genealogy and DNA phenotyping. Could Parabon extract a better DNA profile from the biological evidence on Jody's boot? Could they use genetic genealogy to finally identify her killer? The answer was yes, but it wouldn't be easy. Parabon's specialists went to work on the degraded DNA sample, using cutting-edge extraction techniques that hadn't existed even a few years earlier. Through painstaking laboratory work, they were able to construct a more complete genetic profile, one suitable for uploading to genealogy databases. In late 2018, they submitted the profile to GEDmatch. The system returned multiple matches, people who shared segments of DNA with whoever had left that biological evidence on Jody's boot 46 years earlier. None of these people were suspects themselves. They were distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and had no idea their genetic information would help solve a nearly half-century-old murder. Parabon brought in Deb Stone, an experienced genealogist from Oregon. Stone's job was to take those DNA matches and construct a family tree, working backwards from the matches to find common ancestors, then forward through generations to identify living descendants who matched the age and geographic profile of the suspect. It was meticulous, time-consuming work. Stone spent months building out the family tree, cross-referencing DNA matches with genealogical records, census data, birth certificates, obituaries. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The DNA matches separated into two main branches, suggesting the suspect's maternal and paternal lineages. Stone traced these branches through marriages and births, through immigration records and family histories. And then, in early 2019, she found him. Terrence Miller. Terrence Miller had been 30 years old in August 1972, living in the Edmonds area, less than 5 miles from where Jody's body was discovered. Now 77, he was a retired heavy equipment operator who ran a small ceramics shop out of his home garage with his wife of over 40 years. To all outward appearances, he was an ordinary retiree, a grandfather, someone who had lived an unremarkable life in the same area for decades. But when detectives started digging into Miller's background, disturbing details emerged. In 1968, 4 years before Jody's murder, Miller had been convicted of lewd conduct. In the 1970s, not long after Jody's death, he had molested a preteen girl. There were also allegations, never formally charged, that he had sexually abused children. He fit the profile of a sexual predator, someone who might have attacked and killed a young woman on a secluded road. Still, genealogy alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. The detectives needed to confirm that Miller's DNA actually matched the evidence from the crime scene. They needed his DNA, and they needed to obtain it without alerting him to the investigation. In August 2018, undercover detectives began following Terrence Miller. They watched him from a distance, documenting his movements, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came when Miller visited the Tulalip Resort Casino, about 30 miles north of his home. Detectives watched as Miller bought a coffee, sat at a slot machine for a while, then got up to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he tossed his empty coffee cup into a trash can. The moment he was out of sight, detectives retrieved that cup, carefully bagging it as evidence. The cup was sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. DNA from Miller's saliva on the rim was extracted and analyzed. Then came the moment of truth. Comparing Miller's DNA profile to the DNA profile from the semen found on Jody Loomis's boot 46 years earlier. It was a match. A definitive, conclusive match. After more than 4 decades, investigators finally knew who had sexually assaulted and murdered Jody Loomis. On April 10, 2019, 46 years, 7 months, and 18 days after Jody Loomis was killed, Snohomish County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Terrence Miller's home in Edmonds with an arrest warrant. Miller was taken into custody without incident and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. At a press conference that afternoon, Snohomish County Sheriff Ty Trenery addressed the media and the public, announcing the breakthrough in the county's oldest unsolved murder case. After more than 46 years of searching for her killer, we finally have some answers for Jody's family, Trenery said, his voice heavy with emotion. Thanks to the relentless persistence of our cold case team and new DNA technology, we are one step closer to justice for Jody. The news sent shockwaves through the community. People who remembered the case from 1972 couldn't believe it had finally been solved. Younger residents who had never heard of Jody Loomis were stunned by the story. And for Jody's family, still living in the area, the arrest brought a flood of conflicting emotions. Relief, grief, anger, and a bittersweet sense of vindication. Rosemary Loomis, now in her 80s, released a statement through the sheriff's office thanking the investigators who had never given up on her daughter's case. Jana Loomis, Jody's younger sister, echoed those sentiments, but also expressed the profound sadness that her father hadn't lived to see this day. One of the lead detectives on the case, Jim Scharf, later reflected on what the arrest meant to him personally. He'd been working cold cases for years, and the Jody Loomis case had always haunted him. "I'm hoping that this will be a closure, for me too," Scharf told reporters. Miller was held at the Snohomish County Jail on $1 million bail. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, a charge that carried a potential sentence of life in prison. The investigation continued as detectives tried to piece together more details about the attack and whether Miller might have been responsible for other unsolved crimes. They asked the public for help, requesting that anyone who knew Miller in the early 1970s come forward with information. They wanted to know what kind of car he'd driven, where he'd worked, his routines and habits. They were also still searching for Jody's horse bridle, which had never been recovered from the crime scene. Miller, through his attorney, declined to cooperate with investigators. He maintained his innocence and prepared for trial. The story of Jody Loomis's murder is one that shows both the worst and the best of humanity. The senseless violence that took a young woman's life, and the tireless dedication of investigators who refused to let her case be forgotten. But what happened next, during Miller's trial, and in the hours leading up to the verdict, would add another tragic chapter to this already heartbreaking story. If you're finding this case as gripping as we are here at Untold Case Desk, please take a second to hit that like button. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on genetic genealogy and cold cases, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We cover the true crime cases that deserve to be remembered, the victims who deserve justice, no matter how long it takes. Now, let's continue with what happened when Terrence Miller finally faced trial for Jody Loomis's murder. In a controversial decision that surprised many observers, Terrence Miller was able to post the $1 million bail set by the court. He had to come up with $100,000 in cash to a bail bondsman, money he would never get back. The court ordered him to surrender any weapons and placed him under electronic home monitoring while he awaited trial. For the Loomis family, knowing that Miller was free, living at home with his wife while they continued to grieve, was almost unbearable. But the legal system had to follow its prescribed course. Miller was presumed innocent until proven guilty, and he had the right to prepare his defense. Miller's attorney, Laura Martin, a public defender assigned to his case, began building a defense strategy. She would argue that the DNA evidence was flawed, that the chain of custody for the evidence had been broken during the decades it sat in storage, and that contamination could have occurred. She maintained that her client was innocent, and that the prosecution's case was based on what she would later call a botched DNA analysis. The months dragged on. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, further delaying the trial. Court proceedings were shut down, then slowly reopened with strict safety protocols. It wasn't until October 2020, more than a year after Miller's arrest, that his trial finally began. Phone calls Miller made from jail while awaiting trial were recorded, as is standard procedure. In several of these calls to his wife and family members, Miller made statements that prosecutors would find significant. He apologized to his wife for ruining her life. He told friends and family that the evidence was strong and that he expected to go to prison. He said things would not turn out well for him. These weren't quite confessions, but they weren't the words of a man confident in his innocence either. On October 26, 2020, opening statements began in the murder trial of Terrence Miller. Due to COVID-19 precautions, the trial looked different from most. Jurors were seated with social distancing in the gallery where the public typically sat. Everyone wore masks. Miller, now 78 years old, arrived in court wearing a blue 3-ply mask, a silver and white striped tie, and a loose dark gray suit over a white button-down shirt. The prosecution, led by Snohomish County Deputy Prosecutor Craig Matheson, laid out their case methodically. They presented the timeline of Jody's final ride, the discovery of her dying on that dirt road, and the decades-long investigation that followed. They explained how DNA evidence had been preserved, but overlooked, then rediscovered and analyzed using cutting-edge technology. Matheson held up photographs of Jody's hiking boot, the boot where DNA evidence had been preserved for 46 years. He explained to the jury how genetic genealogy had led investigators to Miller, and how the coffee cup from the casino had provided the definitive match. This, Matheson told the jury, holding up an image of the DNA comparison, is how we know beyond any reasonable doubt that Terrence Miller sexually assaulted and murdered Jody Loomis on August 23, 1972. The prosecution called forensic experts who explained the DNA analysis process, showing how Miller's genetic profile matched the biological evidence from the crime scene. They brought in the genealogist, Deb Stone, who walked the jury through the family tree she'd constructed, explaining how she'd narrowed down thousands of potential relatives to identify Miller as the suspect. They presented Miller's prior criminal history, his convictions for lewd conduct and child molestation, establishing a pattern of sexual violence. They played recordings of Miller's jailhouse phone calls, where he'd admitted the evidence was strong against him. Defense attorney Laura Martin fought back hard. She argued that the DNA evidence was unreliable, that crucial pieces of evidence in the case had been lost or destroyed over the decades. She pointed out that the evidence had been unaccounted for the better part of 3 decades, raising questions about chain of custody and potential contamination. Martin alleged that contamination had occurred during laboratory testing, that an analyst had even accidentally contaminated the boots with his own DNA. She argued that the DNA sample found on the boot didn't tell the whole story and didn't definitively point to Jody's killer. "What I can tell you," Martin told the jury in her closing arguments, "is that the only evidence against my client is a botched DNA analysis of the outside of a boot. The prosecution wants you to convict a man based on degraded, contaminated evidence that sat in a storage room for decades." She emphasized that Miller and Loomis had never known each other, that there was no established connection between them, no motive, no witness testimony. She argued that the genetic genealogy technique was relatively new and untested, that it could lead to false identifications. But the jury had heard the scientific testimony. They'd seen the DNA comparisons. They'd listened to the experts explain how Miller's genetic profile matched the crime scene evidence to a degree that made misidentification virtually impossible. They'd heard Miller's own recorded words expressing his belief that he would be convicted. On Friday afternoon, November 6, 2020, the jury began their deliberations. The weekend passed with no verdict. The jury continued deliberating on Monday morning, November 9th, carefully reviewing the evidence, discussing the scientific testimony, weighing the prosecution's case against the defense's arguments. While the jury deliberated, Terrence Miller was at his home in Edmonds, still under electronic monitoring, but surrounded by his family. What went through his mind that morning, we'll never fully know. Did he reflect on what he'd done 48 years earlier? Did he think about Jody Loomis, about the life he'd stolen from her? Did he consider the family he'd torn apart, the decades of grief he'd caused? Or did he simply think about himself, about the prospect of spending whatever years he had left in a prison cell? At approximately 10 o'clock that Monday morning, November 9th, a family member found Terrence Miller's body at the home. He had taken his own life. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office was immediately notified, and the scene was processed. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner would later officially confirm that Miller's death was suicide. But here's where the legal system faced an unusual situation. The jury was still deliberating. They had no idea that the defendant they were deciding the fate of was already dead. The judge made the decision not to inform them, allowing them to complete their deliberations without the knowledge of Miller's death influencing their verdict. At approximately 1 o'clock that afternoon, just 3 hours after Miller's body was discovered, the jury reached their verdict. They filed back into the courtroom, taking their seats. The judge asked if they'd reached a unanimous decision. The foreman stood and confirmed they had. Only then were the jurors informed that Terrence Miller was dead, that he would never serve the sentence they'd helped deliver. The news hit them hard. Several jurors were visibly shaken, grappling with the knowledge that their verdict had come too late to see Miller face the consequences of his actions. The reaction to Miller's suicide was complex and varied. Prosecutor Craig Matheson told reporters that while Miller's death was unexpected, it didn't diminish the importance of the verdict. "We got an answer, whether Mr. Miller was there or not," Matheson said. "It does not diminish the verdict." Detective Jim Scharf, who'd worked tirelessly on the cold case, expressed similar sentiments. "I'm glad that we got to hear the verdict," he told the Seattle Times. "I think that was good for the family." For the Loomis family, the news was devastating in a different way. Rosemary Loomis and Jana had waited 48 years for this moment, for justice, for the chance to see their loved one's killer face the consequences of his actions. And in the final hours, he'd escaped that reckoning. Their reaction, as described by prosecutors, was stoic. Defense attorney Laura Martin saw it differently. In a statement released after the verdict, she expressed her belief that Miller had been innocent, that the evidence against him was flawed, and that his suicide was the act of an innocent man driven to despair by tainted evidence. "Death seemed preferable to letting a jury decide a verdict on tainted evidence," Martin wrote. "This is a terrible tragedy that began with Jody Loomis's death and is compounded by an innocent man taking his own life. But the scientific evidence was clear. The DNA match was definitive. And Miller's own recorded words expressing his expectation of conviction suggested that he knew the truth would come out. Legally, the conviction stood. Even though Miller had died before the verdict was read, the jury had completed their deliberations and reached their decision. The court entered a formal guilty verdict in the case. For the record books, for history, and most importantly for Jody's family, Terrence Miller was officially convicted of her murder. The Jody Loomis case became a landmark example of how forensic genealogy could solve even the coldest of cold cases. It joined cases like the Golden State Killer in demonstrating the power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge genetic technology and genealogical research. In the years since Miller's conviction, forensic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of additional cold cases across the country. Victims and families who had long given up hope have finally received answers. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder decades earlier have been identified and brought to justice. But the technique has also raised important questions about privacy, about the ethics of using DNA databases that were created for genealogical purposes for law enforcement applications. Many people who submitted their DNA to services like Ancestry.com or 23andMe never imagined their genetic information might be used to identify their distant relatives as criminals. The debate over where to draw the line between public safety and personal privacy continues. For Rosemary and Jana Loomis, the conviction brought a measure of closure, even if it didn't erase the pain of nearly 5 decades without answers. They could finally say with certainty who had killed Jody, even if they couldn't confront him in court, even if they couldn't see him sentenced and led away to prison. In statements after the trial, they expressed gratitude to the detectives who had never stopped working the case, to the forensic specialists who had extracted DNA from decades-old evidence, to the genealogist who had painstakingly constructed the family tree that led to Miller. They thanked the prosecutors who had built a strong case, and the jury who had delivered the verdict. Most of all, they hoped that Jody's story would inspire other families dealing with unsolved cases never to give up hope, that advances in technology and the dedication of cold case investigators could still bring justice even decades after a crime. It's important that we don't let the story of how Jody Loomis's case was solved overshadow who Jody actually was. She wasn't just a victim, wasn't just a name in a case file or a photograph in a news article. She was a real person with dreams and plans and people who loved her. Jody was described by those who knew her as someone who always spoke her mind, who didn't back down from what she believed in. She was studying to become a nurse because she wanted to help people, to make a difference in their lives during their most vulnerable moments. She was engaged to be married, looking forward to building a life with someone she loved. She adored animals, especially her horse. That love of animals was what led her to take that bicycle ride on August 23, 1972. She was just going to visit her horse, to spend time with an animal she cared for on a warm summer evening. She should have been safe. She should have made it to that stable and back home again. Instead, she encountered Terrence Miller on that secluded dirt road. What exactly happened in those final moments, we'll never know with certainty. But we know that Miller attacked her, sexually assaulted her, and shot her in the head, leaving her to die alone in the woods. For 48 years, Jody's family lived with the agony of not knowing who had done this. They endured decades of wondering if the person who killed their daughter and sister was still out there, living freely, perhaps even having lived a normal life while they suffered. The pain of not knowing, in many ways, was worse than knowing the terrible truth. The case of Jody Loomis is a powerful reminder that cold cases are never truly closed, not as long as there are investigators willing to keep searching for answers and families who refuse to give up hope. It's a testament to the power of modern forensic science to reach back through decades and shine light on the darkest crimes. It's also a stark illustration of how sexual predators like Terrence Miller can hide in plain sight for decades, living seemingly normal lives while carrying terrible secrets. Miller had a criminal history of sexual offenses, but nothing had connected him to Jody's murder until genetic genealogy finally exposed the truth. For the investigators who worked this case over the years, for Jim Scharf and the cold case unit that finally cracked it, Jody Loomis was more than just a case number. She was a young woman who deserved justice, whose family deserved answers. They never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would identify her killer. And they were right. 47 years is a long time to wait for justice. It's longer than Jody lived, longer than many of the investigators who worked her case have been alive. But in the end, the truth emerged. Terrence Miller was identified, arrested, tried, and convicted. He may have escaped earthly punishment through suicide, but he did not escape being known as Jody Loomis's murderer. For Rosemary and Jana Loomis, for all of Jody's extended family and friends, the conviction finally brought the closure they'd sought for nearly half a century. They could grieve fully, knowing the truth. They could honor Jody's memory without the shadow of unanswered questions hanging over them. Jody Loomis was 20 years old when her life was stolen from her. She's been gone now for more than 50 years, but she's not forgotten. Her case helped pioneer the use of forensic genealogy in cold cases. Her story has inspired families of other victims to keep hoping, keep pushing for answers. And her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the work of investigators who continue to seek justice for cold case victims. If you or someone you know is experiencing thoughts of suicide, please reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 at 988. You are not alone, and there are people who want to help. For families dealing with unsolved cases, organizations like the DNA Doe Project and the Vidocq Society work to help solve cold cases using modern forensic techniques. Never give up hope that answers may still be found. Thank you for watching this episode of Untold Case Desk. If this story moved you, if you believe in the importance of never giving up on victims of unsolved crimes, please hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us what you think about the use of genetic genealogy in cold cases. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss an episode. We cover the cases that deserve to be remembered, the victims who deserve justice, no matter how long it takes. Until next time, this is Untold Case Desk, reminding you that the truth has a way of surfacing, even after nearly half a century. Rest in peace, Jody Loomis. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied.